Conservatives are celebrating today. They've found the smoking gun that will take down Obamacare. And if you haven't heard of Gruber Gate yet, you're going to be hearing a lot about it soon. The context: two cases working their way through the courts, brought by conservative activists, saying that under a strict reading of the Affordable Care Act, subsidies are available to individuals only if they buy insurance through state-run exchanges like Kentucky's Connect or California's Covered California, but not if they purchase insurance through state exchanges administered by the federal government. One commonly referred to as the Federal Exchange, which serves 36 states and through which more than 7 million people will receive federal subsidies by 2016, according to recent analysis. Two Republican-appointed judges on the three-judge panel of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals found in favor of that argument. Three democratically appointed judges on the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals came to the opposite conclusion, saying the ACA provides subsidies to qualifying individuals in every state, regardless of who administers the exchange. This conflicting reading from those appeals courts may ultimately be resolved by the Supreme Court. Until then, it's a non-issue, because in May of 2012, the IRS issued a rule clarifying that subsidies would also be available to the states that join the federal exchange. But now, elated conservatives are pointing to a tape of one of the ACA's consultants, arguably one of its architects, Jonathan Gruber, on January 18, 2012, speaking about the law to a nonprofit organization in Falls Church, Virginia, and Gruber said this.
What's important to remember politically about this is if you're a state and you don't set up an exchange, that means your citizens don't get their tax credits. But your citizens still pay the taxes that support this bill. So you're essentially saying your citizens, you're going to pay all the taxes to help all the other states in the country. I hope that that's a blatant enough political reality that states will get their act together and realize there are billions of dollars at stake here in setting up these exchanges, and that they'll do it.
That's not the only time. About a week earlier, on January 10th, 2012, speaking to the Jewish Community Center in San Francisco, he said this.
When the voters in states see that by not setting up an exchange, the politicians of their state are costing state residents hundreds of millions and billions of dollars, that they'll eventually throw the guys out. But I don't know that for sure. And that is really the ultimate threat, is will people understand that, gee, if your governor doesn't set up an exchange, you're losing hundreds of millions of dollars of tax credits to be delivered to your citizens.
The voters didn't seem to understand that because, well, no one understood it that way. And I mean almost literally no one. Gruber has since said he misspoke. But the real point here is that these pieces of tape are so newsworthy for this reason. In what was the most discussed, debated legislation in over a generation, essentially no one at the time the bill was being discussed interpreted the law in the way Jonathan Gruber did in those two small bits of speaking. I covered this bill. Conservatives covered it too. And while the bill was being debated and voted on, almost no one was suggesting the subsidies would apply only to state-run exchanges. The contention now from conservatives is that the vast, overwhelming majority of people who wrote the law, the people who voted for the law, implemented the law, commented on the law, debated and discussed the law, right, left, and center, Republican and Democrat, House and Senate, broadcast and print, all of those people didn't understand what they were talking about. Joining me now, Ovik Roy, Forbes opinion editor and author of How Medicaid Fails the Poor. Ovik, you first wrote about this, and how you doing? You first wrote about this in 2011 when it was sort of, I would say, discovered in certain ways by a commenter, I believe, on a blog. But before 2011, when you were covering this, and you were as chest deep in the wonkiness of the ACA as anyone, did you write at all about this, what is now being accepted as fact on the right, that you can't accept subsidies in state exchanges?
So I've only been writing about health policy effectively since March 2010. So I wasn't around. I wasn't blogging during the procedure in Congress where all this passed. But let me tell you something, Chris. Jonathan Gruber was exactly right in those clips you played. The fact is, if the federal exchange goes down, then what you're going to see is nearly every state is going to set up their own exchange. Right. The reason states didn't set up their own exchange is because they had no incentive to. They will have an incentive to if the federal exchange goes down. So it's not, Obamacare is never going to get unraveled even if this case goes to the Supreme Court.
So there's a bunch of stuff here. There's three things I would say. One is a sort of, I find, astoundingly bad faith that everyone is now pretending retroactively that, of course, this was the interpretation of the law when I was there and they were all there, we were all writing about it and no one was saying that. But put that aside for a second. You make a really good point about what would the politics be if this were true. And if I didn't care so much about people's health insurance, I would say, okay, sure. You know, go ahead, take it away from those 36 states and immediately create this incredible political issue in all those 36 states in which Democrats can say, with a one-sentence law, we can get your subsidies back to what they were last year.
Well, I would hope that if the Supreme Court does overturn or or overrule the IRS on this particular point, they would factor in some sort of transition so states would have the opportunity to set up exchanges without disrupting coverage for people. But I guarantee you, I'll bet you dinner at the nicest restaurant in Brooklyn or your favorite restaurant in Brooklyn, that all the Republican states will set up exchanges because it's all federal money, and no state governor is going to say, well, since I'm not putting any of the money up, then I'm going to turn away hundreds of millions of dollars, as Jonathan Gruber pointed out in those clips.
But Ovik, everyone was saying that when the Supreme Court ruled, very surprisingly, I would add, back during the ACA case, when they ruled that the mechanism to force states to take the Medicaid expansion was unconstitutional for, in my mind, dubious reasons. And everyone said, well, no one's going to walk away from hundreds of millions of dollars for people. And lots of states are walking away from hundreds of millions of dollars for people.
There's two things I would say. A number of Republican states haven't walked away. They've taken the money. But more importantly, there's a big difference between Medicaid and exchanges, because the Medicaid, the states are on the hook for a substantial amount of the money. Yes, it's only 10% of the total expansion dollars, but for a state, that's actually a lot of money.
It's 0% this year.
Well,
right?
Eventually, in perpetuity, after a certain transition, it's 10%. And that's a lot of money for a lot of states, and states are worried that their obligation is going to increase there. The federal exchange, or the exchanges, I should say, the health insurance exchanges, are entirely funded by the federal government. The operation, the states have to pay a little bit there, but they can recover that money from the insurance companies. So there, it really is an overwhelming fiscal case. The hospital lobbies will be all over this. The insurance lobbies will be all over this. Obviously, the uninsured, progressive activists, a lot of people are going to be all over this. There's going to be enormous pressure, I guarantee that. So this whole idea that the law is going to unravel, I mean, to me, that's crazy. It's not going to happen that way.
I agree that the law won't unravel, but I think that the politics of resistance to Obamacare have been far more dogged than I think many anticipated at many different junctures. I think there's a lot of different points at which people thought that you're going to get basically buy-in for this law. And I agree. I think we've gotten to the point where enough people are benefiting from the law that we've got this sort of incumbency effect, but we will see. Ovik Roy from Forbes, always a pleasure. Thanks, man.